Hey, how's it going, everybody? It's Mike Weber here, and today I want to talk about something that Grant Cardone says and is well known for, which is that buying a single-family home or a personal residence is just a terrible idea, and essentially everybody should just absolutely avoid that. So although there may be some good points to this for certain people, I think for the average person, this is absolutely terrible advice, and in some cases, catastrophic advice for them. There are really several important factors that you have to analyze and take into account when making a decision of whether or not you should buy a personal home for you and your family, and simply listening to somebody like Grant Cardone's advice is definitely not a smart move. So, before I jump in and tell you why I think this is bad advice, I want to go ahead and share a story with you to help illustrate what I'm talking about. And before doing that, I want to paint a little bit of a background as to who I am and what I do, so the story will make a lot more sense to you. So I've been working as a real estate agent here in the South Bay for several years, and for almost that entire time, I've door knocked in multiple communities here in the area. And over the years of door knocking and meeting people, I've run into a multitude of retired people who bought here in the South Bay 30, 40, 50, even in some cases 60 years ago. And the amount that these people paid for their homes back then was, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, depending on how long ago they bought. Now, we're all aware how much home prices have risen over time and how much inflation we've had over the last 40, 50, 60 years in the economy. And most of these homes and most of these communities today are worth over $1 million, in some cases even more. So the story is that there's two women named Susan and Jill. Now, Susan and Jill both went to college together, and they were good friends. They ended up getting a job here in the South Bay in the aerospace industry. They both earned pretty decent salaries. They had very similar interests to one another. They liked to eat out, they liked to travel, and they had a lot of expensive hobbies and activities that they really enjoyed doing. So a few years into their employment, things were going well, and Jill really wanted to buy a home for herself. She had seen how well real estate had worked for her parents as she grew up, and she decided, hey, there's no better time than now. So she went out, she started looking at homes, and at the time they were $20,000, which seemed like a lot of money to her at the time, but she knew that it was the right decision, and she went ahead and pulled the trigger, and she purchased a home. And Susan, on the other hand, had a very close friend that she trusted, and that friend told her that buying a home was a bad idea, and that the right thing to do was just to stay a renter and to never buy a home. And since she really trusted this friend, she just went ahead and took his advice, and she continued to rent. And so Susan's payment was just slightly less than what Jill's was for Jill to actually own the home. And Susan felt good about this. She had a little bit of extra discretionary income that she could use to do the things that she liked, and all was well. Neither of the two women really invested much money in these beginning years because, Jill had bought the house that was fairly expensive for her at the time, and Susan was enjoying, the lifestyle in the area and traveling and doing all the fun things that she liked to do. So about 10 years in, Susan's landlord decided that he wanted to go ahead and sell the property because property values had went up rather substantially over the last 10 years. And the new owners decided that they actually wanted to move into Susan's unit, so they went ahead and gave Susan notice to move out. And so when Susan got out there, she started looking in the community for rental properties, and to her surprise, the cost for rent had risen rather substantially, as well as real estate prices during that 10-year period. And not to mention, it was also extremely competitive just finding a place to live here in the South Bay. And so Susan was not willing to compromise on the neighborhood and the area that she lived in, and there was very little available on the market. But she did end up finding a place, and the rent was substantially more than she had been paying at her current place, but she decided that she wasn't willing to move, and she went ahead and she rented that place. Both women started earning more money over that 10-year period, and so Jill's mortgage payment was fixed, and she had a friend that told her that it was a good idea to start investing some of her discretionary income in stocks and bonds. And she went ahead and heeded that advice and started investing a lot of her discretionary income in assets because she had a fixed mortgage payment. Whereas Susan, on the other hand, was spending more and more of her earnings towards her rent, and she wasn't able to invest any of her discretionary income into other assets. She did have a small retirement that was accruing through her work, but it was very little and it was growing very slowly. So over the next 10 years, Susan's landlord raised rents aggressively on her because rents in the area were going up quickly, and he was a smart landlord. And so, of course, Jill stayed in her home and her mortgage payment stayed the same. She never bothered to take money out or refinance or use any of her equity or anything like that. And right at 20 years or another 10 years into Susan living in this new property with much, much higher rents, just like clockwork, her landlord decided to go ahead and sell that property as well. And sure enough, the new owners wanted to move into Susan's unit, so they gave her notice to move. And once again, she was faced with going out there and looking for a rental in the highly competitive Beach City market. And so what she came to find is that prices had gotten so high for rentals that she actually couldn't cover her bills and expenses and live in the same neighborhood anymore. So even though she didn't want to move, she had no choice, and she had to move to a less desirable neighborhood that made her feel a lot less safe, that was, in close proximity so she could still get to work, but was affordable, that ultimately she could kind of squeeze into her budget. And for Jill, over that same 10-year period, since her mortgage was fixed, she started investing more and more of her disposable income in assets over that time. She grew much more comfortable and confident in her life and relaxed because she knew that she had a ton of equity. In fact, during that time period, real estate values had gone up about 10 times. So Jill felt very comfortable and confident knowing that she had a lot of equity, that she could sell her house at any time if she needed to and move somewhere cheaper and actually just buy a house outright with that cash. Not to mention that her portfolio of investments started to grow pretty substantially, and this was in addition to her retirement through her work or her pension plan, as well as potential Social Security income when she retired. So fast forward another 5 years, this is roughly 25 years into the story, and Jill is just absolutely ecstatic because she realizes that in just 5 years, her very reasonable and affordable mortgage will be paid off, and she'll be able to live, mortgage free for the rest of her life in a neighborhood that she's really happy about. At that point, her portfolio had grown substantially, and she was already confident that if she retired at 60, that with her home being paid off and her portfolio along with Social Security and her pension plan through her work, that she'd actually be able to live comfortably for the rest of her life on her passive income being generated by those assets, because she would only have very low fixed costs of property taxes and maintenance on her property. Now, unfortunately for Susan, during that period of time, the rents just really started to squeeze her, and she became very stressed out through those years because the rents kept rising. It was absorbing more and more of the income that she had. She had to cut back a lot during that time period and become a lot more frugal. She wasn't able to do a lot of the things that she really enjoyed because they were just too expensive. And so right at 60 years old, Jill said, you know what? I'm doing so well. I'm just going to go ahead and retire and travel and enjoy my remaining years. So Jill went ahead and retired. Her home was completely paid off. She had great passive income from all of the investing that she had done, and she was very happy with the life and the decisions that she had made. On the other hand, Susan was getting growingly stressed out and frustrated and didn't really know what to do. She was thinking about moving out of state somewhere that was less expensive, maybe trying to find another job, but she was really afraid to give up the job that she had worked at her whole life, so she decided to go ahead and stick it out. She made it another 5 years until she was 65, and at that point, the stress just wore her down to the point where she couldn't work anymore. She just couldn't handle the expenses and the rising living costs. And even though her wages had gone up over that time, she felt that in real dollars, she wasn't that much better off, and that actually costs were rising faster than she was earning. So she decided to go ahead and move out of state to an area with a really warm climate that was quite a bit more affordable, where she was able to rent a 1-bedroom apartment where she could, make do with what she had with her small retirement that she had saved up, and the rent made sense. And so for the next 10 years she lived there. She made ends meet. It was pretty difficult and tough, but around 10 years in, her retirement ran out and she had no money left. So she was basically forced to live out her remaining days until she passed away on Social Security, and it was very difficult. She really just had enough money to cover her rent and the food that she needed to eat. So it was a difficult and tough time for her until she ended up passing away. Now, Jill, on the other hand, retired comfortably at 60. She ended up traveling the next 20 years until she passed away at 80 years old. And at that time when she passed away, her home was appraised at $1.2 million and she still had $1.5 million in assets in her portfolio and her retirement accounts. And so while Jill was younger, she did get pregnant and had a baby. She never got married, but her daughter, who at that time was 42 years old, had 2 kids and was married and was doing okay, but not great. And so Jill decided to leave all of her assets in her home to her daughter. So the daughter and the husband talked about what they should do with the house, and they decided that the smartest thing to do was to go ahead and keep the house and just rent it out, since they could get $5,500 a month in rent for the property, and then they would use the other money and invest it wisely and live on that. And so the $5,500 a month was enough to cover most all of their fixed costs, their mortgage payment, etc. And so this worked out very, very well for them, which really helped to give them a much better quality of life as that rental income increased and their costs remained relatively fixed because they also had a fixed mortgage on their home. They were more and more comfortable as time went on. And they lived into their 70s and went ahead and passed on their assets to their children, which helped their children to have a massive boost in their lives, and so on and so forth. So this is a story of Jill and Susan, and also the story that millions of Americans will tell as inflation continues to skyrocket, wages in real terms continue to stagnate, housing prices and rental prices continue to soar, and pension plans and Social Security become insolvent in the United States. So to answer the question of whether or not you should rent forever or buy a home for yourself, you really need to do a serious self-evaluation. Are you such a savvy investor that over your life you're going to make such sound investment decisions that will allow you to compensate for deciding to pay rent for your entire life and not having the safety and comfort of having a home that at someday will be paid off, offering you mortgage-free living for the rest of your life that appreciates vastly over time and offers you substantial tax benefits while you're working? If you are, then maybe buying a home is not a great idea for you. Are you able to rent at such an affordable rate for some reason compared to the average person that this will allow you to take a lot of that extra income that you're not paying on a mortgage to invest that strategically in order to compensate for not purchasing? Or are you like most other people who have to go out there into the rental market and pay market rents in order to rent that continue to rise over time? And if you are, how long will this situation last for you before you do have to go out there and rent at market rates? In Los Angeles, for instance, market rents tend to follow pretty closely to what the total cost of ownership is for a property at any given time. Now, of course, this fluctuates and goes up and down. Right now, currently, in many cases, in many areas, if you purchase a home, your net payment for mortgage, interest, property taxes, and insurance is oftentimes a little higher than what it would cost to rent the same property, but this doesn't factor in the tax benefits, the equity buildup, and the appreciation that you gain from owning the property over time. Further, as time goes on and rents continue to rise, if you stay a renter, you're going to be stuck paying higher and higher and higher rents, whereas the person who bought is going to have the comfort and knowledge that their payment is fixed until paid off 30 years later or sooner if they're able to pay it off early, which is going to make a huge difference as time go on. And essentially, it's like having a forced savings account. So all in all, when you add it all up and you look at it objectively, if you're not a super savvy investor or you're not able to live somewhere very inexpensively, there's certainly a multitude of benefits to buying a home versus being a renter for the rest of your life. So, to finally answer the question of whether or not you should buy or you should rent for your whole life, it really depends on the circumstances, your skill and knowledge as an investor, and the clarity and understanding of the decision that you're making and how it's going to affect your long-term future. No doubt there are people out there that can achieve more by not purchasing a primary residence. However, in my experience, for the average person out there, buying a single-family home is the absolute best decision they will ever make in their entire lives, as long as they don't pull money out over time and refinance the property or use a home equity line or anything like that. Or, to answer the question another way, do you want to be a Jill or a Susan?